Hello and welcome to The Rundown, a weekly podcast from PoliticsHome. I'm your host, Alain Tolhurst, and for this special Christmas episode, we're going to be taking a look at the wild year in Westminster and the 10 insane moments that define British politics in 2022. To try and make sense of a year unlike any other, I'm joined by two top PoliticsHome colleagues, political reporter Eleanor Langford and our editor Laura Silver, making her podcast debut, and I'm delighted to say we're also joined by James Heale, diary editor of The Spectator and a Liz Truss biographer. So we're going to start with the first moment. Let's go back to January, if any of us can remember that. And Partygate was in full swing, and the suitcase of wine. Ellie, the suitcase of wine was this amazing idea. That people in Number 10 were going out and collecting supplies of wine for this special wine fridge that they'd bought apparently in the Number 10 press office, which no longer exists apparently, or is just full of soft drinks now. I think is the rule. And what are your memories of that time really?
Well, I can remember that it was just everyone just responded with absolute ridicule because it's absolutely ridiculous to be going to fill a suitcase with wine, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. We were just saying before this about, was it the Heart Radio presenters trying to run from their Leicester Square studio to the Strand Co-op where they bought the wine and back, laden with wine to see how quickly they could do it.
Yeah.
I think
that's when you know you're in trouble, I think, when you've got when Heart FM go against you.
Do we know what wine they had?
That is a good question.
Which of Cohort's finest?
Yeah. Did they go own brand or did they go,
I seem to remember when the final
above?
Sue Gray report came out and there was blurred there was some Castello del Diablo, I think, was in there, I think.
Honestly, Bellingcat had nothing on Westminster's finest. They were all over identifying open access, journalism like that. Within 5 minutes, I put a tweet up and someone had identified the exact bottle and cost at the Co-op.
Very familiar bottle of Prosecco, about £7.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that was very obvious, wasn't it? And that, on a serious note, that was kind of when it was really started to get serious for the government. That was when they'd launched the first investigation. Simon Case, who then hilariously had to stand down because he himself was implicated in parties, and Sue Gray was first came on the scene as this sort of investigative figure, this gnomic presence. And obviously, Boris Johnson had to apologise to the House of Commons after he admitted that he'd been to this BYOB event. James, that was one of my favourite ones, was that going through those emails of people that bring your own booze. I mean, it was hard then for the government to really suggest there hadn't been partying when you've literally got booze in the name of the email.
Yes, and it was Martin Reynolds who sent that, who quickly earned the nickname Party Marty.
Marty, yeah.
And I think it just showed there were so many different events. That was the thing. I remember struggling to keep track of it, or keeping a running tally online, and there were stories popping up every other day, it seemed. And also, obviously Pippa Career and Paul Brand did great work, but other journalists too, Tony Diver of The Telegraph, these stories were coming up everywhere, really. I think we got down to about 14 events, and there was an outcry when the Met would only agree to probe 10 of them or thereabouts. So it really was the scale, and just the government's insistence that no rules be broken at any time just didn't hold as a line, did it?
And then they had to apologise. That Tony Diver story, which was the one about the suitcase of wine, was the parties on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. And Laura, that I think that was the point at which I think a lot of people turned from it being this sort of frivolous story to being actually that's where people really started to care, that the difference between how people acted in Number 10 and how people were acting in the rest of the country.
I think so, and most of the original Partygate stuff had come from The Mirror and The Guardian, and I think the government had probably tried to suggest that they were hostile papers and that it could go away. And then when you get someone like The Telegraph, and not only The Telegraph, you've wronged the Queen. This is absolutely not going away. And I think, the beginning of 2022, there was this sense of what fresh hell is this year going to bring? And then Partygate was not something in the past. It was not something that was going to go away. It snowballed. And I don't think it helped that people were home and bored in January still. Because
it was that contrast of images, wasn't it, of the Queen by herself with the mask on in Westminster Abbey, and knowing that at that point, at exactly the same time, people were literally spilling out of the back door of Downing Street, having had this wild night. We later found out had someone thrown up on a copy machine.
And the broken children's swing.
They broke the children's swing.
They broke Wilf's Street swing.
They broke Wilf's swing set. Yeah, exactly. It's and obviously at the end of the month we had the first element of the Sue Gray report, which obviously was kind of stymied because it was only the Met inquiry meant that they couldn't publish all of it. But we got one of my favourite quotes of the year from Conor Burns, who said that the Prime Minister was ambushed by a cake.
I remember very vividly. I think you might have been there as well.
Yes. It was outside the Red Line.
We were outside the Red Line.
A member of Connor's staff was there, and I think he had about 10 journalists come up to him and mock him to his face.
Yeah.
And believe he wasn't drinking before, he was necking those pints.
He was running back and forth on the phone all evening trying to explain what Conor Burns
I think
meant
we almost
about...
one point went to Tesco and bought him a cake. Like, very
Yeah.
relaxed.
I think actually it's a recurring theme we'll come back to, actually, that some of the people who are the Boris Johnson's strongest supporters and advocates tended to not really be very helpful. I mean, the Ralph Wiggum "I'm helping" meme was used more this year, I think, than almost any other about Johnson. And Conor Burns, one of his staunchest supporters, and in the end made him look a bit more foolish there, really.
I think that's one of the reasons the Queen picture was so significant, though, that a lot of the Partygate stuff was ludicrous, and it was, a fun saga on Westminster Twitter where you've got lines like "ambushed by cake" and "a suitcase of booze," and it was ludicrous.
Yeah.
And I think the general public probably were starting to think, okay, this is silly, but then you get, this very powerful, sad picture of the monarch that just sums it all up, and it's like, no, this is why this is a really significant story.
Of course.
Yeah.
And of course, we were still living, there was a whole debate this time last year, December 2021, about having another lockdown.
Yeah.
So the shadow of COVID was still cast over a lot of the country. And I think, as you say, it looks ridiculous now, but the rules have had to be ridiculous because of how we were dealing with the virus. And so the pure farce of it was something, but also there was a kind of serious edge to that. And people, suffered, as we saw with the image of the Queen.
That idea of having something that's farcical with a serious edge, I think, is probably going to be a theme of a lot of the things we're talking about this year. And number two is Neil Parish standing down for watching pornography in the House of Commons, became known as Tractorgate. I'm going to read you another quote, one of my favourite quotes of the year. He said, "Funnily enough, it was tractors I was looking at, so I did get into another website with sort of a very similar name, and I watched it for a bit, which I shouldn't have done." James, what was your recollections of
I don't
this?
I don't know how long he was watching before he realised, wait a minute, that is a combine harvester, It was. I think it just came at a point where there was a real debate around standards, and that's a recurring theme. Of course, at that time, it was only a few months after the Owen Paterson row, which was about some money, and this was about sex of a kind, really. And I think it showed also that whereas this might have been hushed up, a few years ago or whatever, I think a couple of female Tory MPs were cited as being the source of this at this meeting where Christine Harris, who was then the chief whip, asked them for what their own experiences, and that's when it came out. So I think it showed that there was kind of a different approach in the party towards standards, and of course it was fast, and it led to the by-election, which helped bring down Boris Johnson.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ellie, there was a weird moment when obviously this person, when Neil Parish wasn't named, in the end he named himself, and there was this odd situation, there was this witch hunt about trying to work out which MP it was.
Who's the porn MP?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I won't name him because it was, it's not him, but there was an MP, another Tory MP,
Widely
whose name
named.
became mud, and it was widely expected that he was the person, and it wasn't
It's got to
him
be
at
you,
all.
mate.
Right.
You're the kind of person who watched porn in the House of Commons.
Exactly. It's an absolute nightmare for them. And I remember it being spread on the terrace, just wildfire on the terrace, as hacks having a drink.
I was getting WhatsApps from all sorts of people giving me the same names with a few other names littered in,
Right.
and it was none of the names in the end. So I think that's one of the reasons why Neil Parish got pushed into revealing himself, was because people were saying, look, all your colleagues are getting ripped apart for your mistake, so you've got to come forward.
But when he did reveal himself, he did it through that really soft Weekend magazine interview where he sort of sat at home like, yeah, sorry, it was me. I was watching porn in the Commons. And it was just what?
He has had one of the most bizarre media strategies of any MP I've ever seen, because he then sort of didn't want to stand down, and then he's tried to come back later in the year, and he sort of set himself up as sort of a media commentator. You hear people going to him for comment on stuff. I was like, why are we asking what this guy thinks about the way the Conservatives are going?
It was just pure satire, wasn't it? And I remember that's because that story had broken at the weekend, being around friends that aren't in politics, and they'd see the push alerts or the tweets or whatever and be like, what's this about a tractor? Has he been watching porn? One of those things that sort of seems like it's going to be a mad headline, but actually once you get to the nuance of the story, it's a bit different. And it was like, no, he was watching porn in the Commons, and his excuse was that he thought it was tractors.
Yeah. My favourite character of all this was Mr. Parish's wife, who came out and all men do it. Let me find a wife whose husband hasn't watched porn, and stormed by him and did that kind of photograph together. In
the country kitchen, down in Devon. It was
Mills and Boon, wasn't it?
It was extraordinary, and as you say, we'll come on to it later. But there was two by-elections on the same day. Yeah, and the way that the nuance of that, with them losing one to Labour and one to Lib Dems, was kind of catastrophic. But it came at, like I say, at a time when obviously Boris Johnson was already struggling. And before we go on to the next one, what are your kind of personal, Elliot? What's your personal kind of wildest moment that you've experienced this year as a political journalist?
Oh, I definitely think it was the resignations day when I was sat in Portcullis House in Westminster. And not one but two PPSs who I knew walked past me and were like, yeah, I'm just on my way to resign. Right. And then that first one went by, and the next one was like, yeah, I'm on my way to resign. And it was just the most maddest of days that we physically couldn't keep up.
Yeah, I was in a TV studio across the road, and every time, literally by the time you finished your sentence, someone else had resigned.
I think I broke the scoop of Ed Arger's resigning. But it was, wow, I know, but it was like number 47 or something.
Yeah. Right,
I think it got 2 likes and a retweet, and that was it. No one cared. It was just so many.
Yeah.
Laura, as editor of that, how did you keep on top of like what even is the top line when you've got 57 resignations in a single morning?
Well, I mean, unfortunately for you guys, I was sat on a beach in Italy.
Yes.
You were,
That's
yeah.
why I don't remember what it
was
was.
playing
Yeah,
out.
yeah, okay.
It was our illustrious editor-in-chief, Alain, overseeing that.
Yeah.
But I mean, actually, not to mess with your running order.
No,
That is sort of my wildest moment that I still couldn't take my eyes off it.
Yeah,
so I'm
of
sort of
course.
sat on this sun lounger in Lake Garda, but blasting out Sky News on my phone. And I was luckily with a friend who was a journalist as well, so it was tolerated. But it's like, who's resigned now? Okay, all right, you can read your book for half an hour and you can look at Twitter so that we can keep track of it, and just like shouting out these names of, as you say, PPSs in
Yeah,
Italy.
I watched PMQs on a ski lift earlier this year, which just shows how achingly sad we all are as a group of people. But I'll move on to number 3, the third sort of most insane moment. Obviously, we saw the final Sue Gray report published at the end of May, which kind of was into 15 social gatherings over 8 dates. And the report said the senior leadership at the centre, both political and official, must bear responsibility for this culture. I think perhaps the impact of that report had been blunted by the fact that it dragged on for so long. Yep. And the key moment, I think, for a lot of journalists and for the public was how involved was Boris Johnson and the Chancellor as well. And we found out that they'd been fined over this birthday party in the cabinet office. It made, obviously, the Prime Minister the first sitting Prime Minister to, be found to have broken the law. But in sort of true Johnsonian style, he just sort of brushed did you think that was going to be a moment that would bring him down, or do you think that the Boris bluster would get him through that?
I mean, I think that the willingness of Tory MPs to go out and defend the Prime Minister, as he was then, was certainly sort of, their enthusiasm was blunted down over these periods, because there were so many times. Think of him sort of like a great rampaging elephant, and all these sort of spears being thrown at him, but they were slowing him down.
Yeah.
And I think basically Partygate was the bit where they invested so much credibility in him, so much political capital, but that was basically their patience had run out, and then it was finally one thing that broke the straw that broke the camel's back, which was the Pincher scandal, and that basically brought them down. But it was basically to do with credibility. They couldn't trust the Prime Minister's words anymore, and they were sick of it. I remember one MP just head in their hands, just saying, "I can't trust him," and that was the whole point, which is that he didn't believe what the Prime Minister was going to, the word in his capital, and he was shot as a political figure as a result of that.
Yeah, and Ellie, he then was, after the Sue Gray report came out, he was very bullish, but then he was booed as he went into St Paul Cathedral, and that was kind of, and then there was further booing, wasn't there, at the concert that on that Jubilee weekend. Do you think that was kind of the moment where I think that things sort of really started to turn against Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I think by that point, quite often with events in Westminster, you kind of think it's a bit of a bubble story, and most of the country won't care. But this has gone on for so long. There've been so many headlines, and it was such like a raw issue, the pandemic, that the public did care. And I think half the public were angry, and then the other half were, why are we still going on about this? And that both caused them to boo. And you could kind of see on his face that day that it was a bit like, oh, this isn't good.
Yeah, because I think in Westminster people had just become desensitised to it. Boris Johnson's whole shtick is if you just keep messing up and admitting it and smiling and moving on, you'll get away with it. And he had, and the Tory party also knew what political capital he had, or at least felt he had a lot of political capital in keeping them in power. It was, only 18 months since he'd won that huge majority.
Yeah, and won seats and put together a coalition that people didn't think anyone else could have done.
So I think MPs were really doubling down, like, no, we don't want to lose him because we don't want to lose that. And that Boris Johnson magic, as people have coined it sometimes. But yeah, I think seeing people booing him outside a cathedral, and not a protest, not a load of people they could say was a left-wing anti-government mob. It's like the kind of people that turn up to watch a Jubilee service.
The magic had gone, and then the by-elections as well just killed off the idea. He was a winner, and they think, hang on a sec, we've got a guy who's not delivering, can't trust him, he's getting booed outside the cathedral, and he's not winning elections. What's the purpose of Boris Johnson? Yeah,
and I think a couple of days afterwards, that's when the MPs finally pulled the trigger and called that vote of no confidence, which was a big move. Obviously, he won it 211 to 148, but once it gives him a year's grace period, but as we know from Theresa May, who had the same thing, essentially once you've had a vote of no confidence against you, there really is no coming back, is there, James?
I think basically that's true. We've seen in recent years with the Theresa May one as well. And I think at the point where you've got that much of your party committed against you, it's going to be very difficult to get any kind of agenda through. And as a result, you seem a diminished figure, and you could see its political authority bleeding out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll go up to it later, but I think for me is that the amount of times that ministers would go out with the lines to take, really defend a quite indefensible position, but would because that was what they were told to do, only to then see the government then U-turn or backtrack and undermine what they've said. And we'll come on to the next one, I think, which was...
Well, I was going to say, just at that point as well, there was this sort of real dual private and public thing with MPs, where privately MPs were really expressing that they were sick of him. You would have a list of declared names for letters of no confidence, but you knew there were loads more, and there were certainly MPs that told me that they'd put in a letter but they weren't publicly declaring, so you knew that there was just this huge critical mass of them. And then seeing them on telly or in the papers defending Boris Johnson and just thinking, we know you don't think this.
Yeah.
And I think the public probably knew that too.
Yeah, and I think that contributed towards it. And so moment number 4, which is Boris Johnson's final act as Prime Minister, finally later on, but to resign. Obviously June 23rd, the Tories lost those 2 by-elections, Wakefield to Labour and Lib Dems lost one in Tiverton and Honiton. Oliver Dowden resigned, the kind of first of the resignations. But Johnson at the time said he was thinking actively about fighting the next 2 general elections, which looked back as...
one wasn't quite as seismic, was it? Because I remember that and thinking, okay, right, clear the schedule for Sunday.
Yeah.
We're going to have to deal with this big thing. But yeah, Boris Johnson comes back saying...
It was sort of a straw in the wind, and obviously the fact that Dowden is such a key Rishi Sunak ally, I think it was seen as maybe as trying to sort of like, again, stick another spear in the rhino's hide to see if slow him down. But it didn't slow him down. In fact, it was a classic Johnson issue, which was not tackling a scandal with the Chris Pincher problem that led to his eventual demise.
And of course, remember, he had 3 number 10 reshuffles, if you want to call them that, 3 different chief of staff in about 18 months.
A lot of resets.
Resets, yeah. The January one basically bought him a bit of time, which was the early February, which is, you got Guta Hari brought in.
The shadow whipping operation
exactly.
that he had and all that kind of
Nigel
stuff.
Adams basically, I think, bought him another 6 months.
Which Pincher was a key part of, and obviously, and that's obviously...
But this is the problem, you're making these sort of, rods for your own back by bringing people who, have unfortunately, going to contribute to his own downfall in a different way.
Yeah, and so Ellie, obviously our former colleague Noah Hoffman broke the Pincher story 4 days after leaving us for the Sun.
Yeah, in fact, she
no, not Pincher.
No.
All those awards she's going to win, they're definitely not our awards, really. No.
Yeah, the fun fact about that is that she missed her own leaving drinks.
Right,
We all went to the pub without
did.
her.
We were walking to the pub, she got a phone call, she was like, I've got to go back to the office.
And then the next day,
the story.
so fair enough. So we had her leaving drinks without her.
Yeah.
But yes.
And for me, it was the fact that, it was a classic situation where Johnson number 10 said that they didn't know or they weren't aware. And then as the days went on, more and more came out. We had Simon MacDonald, the Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, formerly saying he was made aware of these things back when they were both in the Foreign Office. He was made aware earlier in the year. And eventually, ministers like Will Quince and Simon Hart were sent out on the weekend shows to deliver these lines that they clearly just weren't happy with. And that kind of, that unhappiness, I think, was one of the direct causes, of the resignation.
It was a perfect double whammy, I think, of obviously Noah broke that incredible story, and then Ione Wells at the BBC on the Monday got the sort of the next stage of it, which I believe was the...
Lord MacDonald. MacDonald, that was the letter.
That was the letter,
it was going public with it.
That was it. And, between the 2 of them, and like you say, them trying to defend it on the Friday and the weekend of them, only half-heartedly defending it.
Yeah.
That really was the final nail in the coffin.
I mean, you guys all speak directly to MPs more than I do, but what was the sense that you got from people as to why it was that was enough? Because, it's a huge scandal and it's a very, very serious and important thing, but so is everything that came before it. Why was this one the thing that tipped him over?
I think it was about credibility, and it was such a stark example whereby, I think, Simon Hart was going out on the Friday trying to keep this line about, Chris Pincher, was Boris aware or not, and he was trying to do it in such a way. Number 10 were like, you need to go harder on your line. And then Will Quince obviously was on LBC on the Monday, and he was going out defending the line, and it got changed within hours. And then on the Tuesday, I think someone I spoke to, number 10, was saying he was shouting at Boris, And so basically they were sick of it. It was basically, I think, that, as I said, the Partygate sort of got rid of all goodwill. The fundamentals of the picture, of course, is at a time when the Tories are sinking in the polls, they're getting down, only about 6 points, whatever, but he's lost the magic, he's lost the winner. And I think it was just basically such a stark example where the line was literally changing within hours. That was where I would say it got to the point of pure farce where you was no longer holding even for that. And once you got that, your credibility's gone.
Yeah, and then we had the 5th of July was when Downing Street admitted actually, that he was aware of those issues. And later that evening, we saw Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak quit and start that. And we had probably the 2 or 3 weirdest days I've ever experienced as a political reporter. We had sort of like education secretaries for one day, and Nadeem Zahawi was made chancellor, and then the following day told the PM to resign. There was a delegation of ministers who walked up number 10 to try and prize him out. And in the end, Boris Johnson said, no, I'm sticking around, but I'm going to sack Michael Gove. Which was the most bizarre bit.
Phone call was, for 5 to 9, he gives him an ultimatum, and Boris calls Michael Gove, and Michael says, oh, Boris, are you resigning? Then, no, sorry, Michael, you are. And that was how he got sacked, which I kind of love, as this sort of 35-year-long relationship dating back to Oxford and ends with them both sort of sacking each other. It was great.
I also love the sort of the swagger of that quote, which I'm sure, they both knew would be briefed, and to Boris Johnson thinking it's this big power move while like 50 ministers resign around him, and it's like, it's probably not.
For me, he was at the liaison committee that day.
Yes,
and
the
Darren
liaison committee,
Jones was literally like, are you aware there's a delegation waiting for you of senior ministers to tell you to resign?
I can remember being sat in Portcullis House and seeing him arrive and being like, oh my goodness, he's actually turned up. We all thought you might
I think it was a respite for everything else that was going on, because he just sort of ignored everything that was going on and started talking about tanks and Ukraine and all this kind of stuff, and completely ignored all that kind of stuff around.
And like, it's like, so you tell me. It's like, no, I've got the photo. I've got the messages here, like showing these. And this hour-long, insane, surreal grilling session where all these select committee chairmen who got their roles primarily because they hate Boris Johnson.
The liaison committees are weird for that reason anyway, because it's the sort of greatest hits of things you want to grill the PM about.
And so it was extraordinary. And then eventually, the penny finally drops, and on the morning of the 7th of July, he stood down. But I felt it was one of the most graceless speeches by a departing prime minister I've ever heard. It was so unrepentant. There was no apology. There was nothing. And he accused MPs of acting like a herd, essentially, when the herd moves.
Wasn't the last time we'd hear that kind of speech?
No, absolutely not. No. And he ended with, I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world, but them's the breaks. Which I think for a person who's so committed to history and quotations, if that is going to be his sort of like epitaph, is them's the breaks. It was hardly the kind of oratorial speech we'd come to expect.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Yeah, that was his final fuse. Yeah, absolutely. Ridiculous.
That will be in history books, those words, hasta la vista, baby.
Has anyone made a supercut of Boris Johnson contrition? We'll
move on to number 5, which is obviously what led into that was the Conservative leadership contest is launched. My favourite of those, of the 11, was Raymond Chisty, the Gillingham MP. We had him in here for a podcast earlier this year. It was genuinely my favourite podcast of the year. He is a remarkable politician. Brave, yeah, in the truest sort of like yes minister sense. Very brave minister, very brave. Who unfortunately did not make the
very sad
threshold this time round.
So was it? Remind me, did they have to have like? How many backers did they have to get on the list? Was it
15, I think?
No, wasn't it 20?
20 for the first
20 for the first round, then it was 30 for the next, and thereafter it was a sort of knock them out.
Yes, exactly. It was like a threshold you had to meet in the first round, and then it was the next
so Raymond ended up having this 24 hours of launking it, and then...
Yes, he unfortunately did not have any declared backers. He said he had lots of positive conversations, but amongst us, there was 11 candidates, and it was... I think the most bizarre launch was Suella Braverman appeared to launch her leadership bid live on the Peston programme, while still the Attorney General, which was frankly extraordinary. You went to a couple of these. What were your kind of memories, Ellie, of going to these various launches on this? The Westminster was extremely hot at that point. It was like 40 degrees.
Yes, I went to. There was a Conservative Way Forward event in the Churchill War Rooms when it was probably the hottest room I've ever been in my life. Some poor young lady fainted.
Right.
And Nadeem Zahawi looked up and carried on with the speech.
He carried on, and like my jaw was on the floor. Like I couldn't believe, because he was aware of it and kept on talking. Him and Suella spoke. I went to Liz Truss's launch where she got lost.
Yes.
She accidentally walked straight past the door and was going to the back of the room, and an aide had to usher her in the correct direction. Bless her. And it was quite an extraordinary time. It was very hot.
Boris Johnson now blames the heat. He now says that basically he says that basically everyone in Westminster got
everyone
too
was just delirious.
Yeah, everyone got too hot and bothered. That's his kind of his.
I can remember we were watching the votes, and I had to text the group chat with our sort of work one, being like, I can't stand in this corridor anymore. I'm going to collapse. Please, someone tap in. And I think all the MPs are feeling the same way. You know,
I had that kind of fortnight was gloriously surreal, and I was at the same event with Ellie, Church of Warhams, and I looked behind me, and I'm with David Frost. We got lost in the Church of Warhams, and I remember asking what I thought was a security guard for it. It was actually one of the waxworks in there.
Oh, I've done that before. it's really easily done in the Church
Excuse
of
me,
Warhams.
yeah. Not get much of an answer. There was that. I remember getting ice lollies at Sajid Javid's launch at the Cinnamon Club. I think they had multiple launches that same day. Penny Mordaunt's one as well.
And that was in a tiny little room.
Yes. It was. The catering at Tom Tugendhat's was very good. They opened up the cafe, and you could just get anything you wanted from the cafe. That was pretty good.
Liz Truss, she got lost on the way out of hers.
Yeah, that was quite remarkable. I mean, and obviously it whittled down to the final two, which was obviously Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And James, there was sort of a kind of a mania took over, which was, Sunak was this right-wing Brexiteer darling, and he was cast as the wet liberal choice, and whereas Liz Truss was a teenage Lib Dem, a Remain supporter, suddenly became this sort of Thatcherite poster girl. I mean, Boris Johnson might say that we all lost our minds. Did we actually lose our minds in that kind of, or did Tory members lose their minds?
I think it was about vibes, wasn't it? The vibes theory of politics, which is the way they conducted themselves. And I think Liz Truss had a more shoot from the hip approach. Sorry,
yeah.
And said Macron friend or foe, etc. I think it was people projected onto her. Perhaps she was maybe more of an unknown, and so they projected onto what they wanted to see. It was more hope rather than expectation. And I think what was really interesting was the dynamics in that contest. As soon as the sort of ERG wing swung behind her, got down to the final two. Yeah. I think what really decided them was basically there was this staunch pro-Boris, anti-Rishi, kind of anti-Trump narrative, perpetuated people like Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah, the stab in the back theory.
Exactly.
I mean, literally, she posted a picture of him stabbing Johnson in the back.
So the whole machine, the Boris Johnson machine, swung behind Rishi.
That's even happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, Nadine Dorries her posting is wonderful, but she also posted at the time, there was a big row about Rishi Sunak's shoes. He was wearing these like £400 loafers.
They were Prada loafers.
Loafers. And she said that Liz Truss gets her earrings from Claire's Accessories.
I mean, Rishi Sunak is a well-dressed man with a budget for it. I think one of the interesting things about that leadership contest as well was how sort of broad and disparate it was. Yeah. And in contrast to the 2019 and 2016 ones where, Boris Johnson was the clear front runner, Theresa May was the clear front runner, whereas we had 11 people, and there were Keamy Badenoch, Suella Braverman, Jeremy Hunt, Penny Mordaunt, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Tom Tugendhat, Nadeem Zahawi, Raymond Christie, Sajid Javid and Grant Shapps. And I think, that's all sorts of wings of the Tory party represented,
it did feel at the start
it?
like it was maybe going to be a genuine discussion about the future of the Tory party. And then in the end, the machine sort of took over and it ended up just being the same old sort of faces again.
And quite a young list as well. And, given we may have an election within the next couple of years that the Tories don't win, if we see Rishi Sunak stand down, I mean, who do you guys think stands out from that list as the future of the Tory party?
Keamy Badenoch for me. I think Jeremy Hunt was like, for instance, was clearly the past. Was never. I think you only really get I think you get sort of two shots. You get a sense where you can be like the outsider coming in, and you have one where you have to win it, and you can't. So I think Keamy Badenoch for me is the one to watch, and I think she'd be the one to watch from the leader of the opposition, perhaps a more punchy performer. But I think Laura makes a great point about the disparate nature. I think the Sunday Times did a graphic where they showed that there were 4 times as many promises made during that leadership contest as there were last time around, and it was a huge. And of course, it ended up being the winner didn't end well. Spoiler. And it ended being by one issue, the mini budget. But it's just funny as you look back, as you say, how and there was increasing this farcical nature as it went on for so many weeks, and the country's economic situation worsened. When all these hustings around the country, so I don't think we'll ever get a kind of leadership contest like that in government again.
No, absolutely not. And I think it's a good point about Kemi that she actually did really well in the hustings, of which there were so many.
And the TV debates as well, I thought.
And I think there was a real sense that was the first time a lot of the country were being introduced to her. When was she elected in 2017? Yeah. So it was very much like a pre-run, and I think you're totally right. I can see her as
and that's one of the stories.
Opposition.
One of the stories this year, I think, is the class of 2010, that Tory generation, people like Matt Hancock, Liz Truss, etc., being eclipsed. And I think what you see now is I thought it was really interesting, that resignation when she resigned from Boris's government, Keamy Badenoch, when the people like Lee Rowley signing her letter. Do you remember there's like 5 resignations together? And I think that's kind of laying down a mark of the 2017 intake of the ones to watch for the future.
Right, well, we're halfway through, so then we'll do a break for a little quick quiz based around the fact that we've had so many ministers this year. So a few questions, all right, So who was Justice Secretary under Liz Truss?
Brandon Lewis.
There we go. One to Heale.
I wrote the book.
That's true. You've got one head. So, but who was the Northern Ireland Secretary between July and September?
I can't remember his name, but I know.
Northern
It
Ireland.
was Vara, wasn't it?
Shailesh Vara.
Oh
There we
my
go.
gosh,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. Which of these MPs was not a minister at any point this year? Okay. So
Okay.
Julie Marson, Alan Mack, Carl McCartney, Holly Mumby-Croft, and Leah Nietzsche. Only one of them was not a minister at some point this
I know
year.
Carl McCartney was briefly.
All year or just in the chaos period?
Well, exactly. At some point
it?
this year.
It's not Alan Mack because he was a.
He was
he
not
was a-
Alan Mack.
I
He
mean,
was at
not
the Treasury
whip.
briefly, yeah.
Was it Holly Mumby-Croft?
Holly Mumby-Croft is the only one. Unfortunately,
well done.
I mean, it was sort of everyone got to be a minister this year
She
for
was
5
just-
minutes.
yeah.
She's the only one who didn't make it. Unfortunately.
I mean,
next year.
I really wasn't sure about
And
that.
the
actually.
final question: there are 5 education secretaries this year. Can we name all 5 education secretaries?
Nadeem Zahawi.
Dear
Yep.
Michelle Donnellan.
Yep. Right, we've got 2.
Wasn't it cleverly?
Cleverly was education secretary. Yes.
Has Therese Coffey done education at any point?
No.
Not this year.
Wait, so we've got 3.
You've got 3. There's the current one. You've not got the current
Well,
one.
Michelle Donlan did it twice, didn't she?
No.
Oh no, because he's the current one. Yeah.
Who's the current one? Exactly. This is great. 3 political journalists. Right.
We should, no, see, this is just a demonstration of how chaotic it is.
Yes,
No one
exactly.
actually
I'll put you out of your misery. So it's Nadeem Zahawi, Michelle Donnellan, James Cleverly, Kit Malthouse, and now it's currently Gillian Keegan. Apologies,
do you know how
Gillian.
bad that
You're
is?
welcome on the
Oh my God.
podcast anytime to talk about your education platform.
Kit Mulhouse was on the cover of one of our auditions, wasn't he, as education
He
secretary?
was, although he was no longer education secretary by the time the magazine came out, I don't think.
No, that was Nadeem Zahawi.
Oh,
actually.
right, yeah,
I'm
well,
pretty sure we had Kit Malthouse in another edition.
Occupational hazard having a 2-weekly magazine,
Well,
a 2-week magazine.
on the plus side, at least you weren't. I think was it Hello Magazine, which did the cover celebrating why this was going to be a great year for the Queen,
Oh, wow.
Oh, God.
which came out after she died.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, let's return to... So Liz, obviously, number 6 is Liz Truss is elected leader, and the famous tweet, ready to hit the ground from day one. And basically, that's
Deliver,
broadly-
deliver,
Never
she
stops
certainly
being
did.
funny. I mean, that is literally what happened.
Yeah.
Johnson, who gave the next one of his kind of graceless speeches, quoted Cincinnatus. James, you're like the sort of person who did Latin at school. So can you explain to us what that quote was all about?
That was about going back to. He was a great soldier, and he returned to his farm.
Yeah.
Basically, sort of laying down his arms and retreating from that, and said he was going to be like that. But of course, he won't. He never leaves the arena. He's always skulking in the wings somewhere.
Right,
basically, so
right.
it's the contrast.
And so that was kind of, I suppose, the hint that Johnson was not going to
Go
leave,
quietly into the night, yes.
Not go quietly, and as we later found, he decided to give it another tilt later on. Obviously, Truss won by a fairly healthy majority, 57.4% to 42.6%.
And it was so obvious she was going to win.
Yeah,
throughout
exactly. And
the last
so
few weeks of
essentially, she
competition.
had that plan that she'd set out. We kind of knew what she was going to do. She was going to hit the ground running. Unfortunately, the third day in the job, the Queen died, and that put a real, damper on it. James, you obviously wrote with our friend Harry Cole the biography of Liz Truss's time. That period, the 10-day mourning period, how important was that in then what we then saw in the mini budget and the problems from there on?
I mean, because of course, on day 2, she announces the energy price guarantee.
Which had been this big thing over the summer as the prices kept going up and the government was not enacting anything. Everyone was very worried going into the winter, and so it needed that to be priority number 1, which she outlined.
Yeah, but I think it sort of spooked the markets by how big it was. So they were all feeling a bit jumpy. Obviously, the world economy was not in a good place. But then we have this mourning period, and I think that mourning period and the period in late August, in early September, where she's going to clearly become, Prime Minister, as Laura says, she's the front runner. A lot of the assumptions were baked into this mini budget, which proved to be later fatal. And I think the mourning period is really interesting because suddenly there was no political criticism, no commentary, whatever. And I think that's when they decided to go for the 45p tax cut, top rate tax. And I think basically it was, as one advisor said to me, it was hubris followed by nemesis, and it sort of had this winning run when there'd been no kind of criticism or anything like that, and then so morning period ends, bang, and then we go straight back into it, and the markets are feeling a bit jumpy from the energy price guarantee. Then the mini budget sort of tends them over the edge, and then you get things like Kwasi Kwarteng telling Laura Kuenssberg that there's more to come, putting petrol on the flames, and that's where we saw the incredible economic situation, which ended with her becoming the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history.
Yeah, that's going into that is point number 7. Kwasi launches the mini budget, blows the door off it basically, and says there's no OBR report to go alongside it, which I think was a key part of it. Scrapping the top rate of tax, cap on bankers' bonuses is gone. Planned rise in corporation taxes ditched, an increase in national insurance is reversed. It was huge. And I remember probably my favourite moment of the year, or most interesting moment, was that we were at Labour conference and we're coming on the way back, and there's 3 of us were all sat there working on the train on the way back, and the pensions market was literally like about to collapse. And I thought the pension market would collapse by the time I got off the train. It was like, what on earth is going on?
It was so horrible. Everybody sort of admittedly hung over on the train on the way back as well from the Tuesday night parties, and the train Wi-Fi was terrible. And I'm just, because I was on a different train.
Yeah, you'd got the earlier
talking
train,
to you guys and just this total panic and thinking, I bet all these people around us don't
And
realise what's happening.
And announcing that mini budget, was it 2 days before Labour conference?
Yeah.
Insane. That top rate of tax, of course, they went to town on that. And it was a tale of 2 conferences. So Labour conference felt much more like a traditional Tory one, very staid, boring, no real dissent, great, lots of suits, business, and the Tory one was a Labour one because everyone was infighting. I remember MPs would literally come up to me when they would say, better hurry up with that book, we're going to get rid of her soon. And I was like, thanks, mate, you're the 3rd one to say that today. And my abiding memory will be the first night of conference.
Yeah.
And going up, there was some drinks thing for some journalists and some cabinet members were there. Grandy's hotel suite, half midnight. I hear a commotion outside. I go outside, and it's my co-author Harry Cole having a stand-up row with a number 10 apparatic, and they're going back and forth. We're going to run it, and it's 45p tax cut. You're killing it. We can't give you. Gives a holding answer. Holding it. We're going to run it. He chases them to the lift, puts his foot in the elevator, closing it, presses send. And at that point, it's 12:30 first night. Everyone is like hammered in that room, and that's when they find out. One cabinet minister just looked at their phone that the 45p tax cut was going to get ditched. They put down the drink, said thanks Harry, and walked off. And that the party was kind of cancelled. Everyone was swept out.
Yeah,
and they need to deal with it.
Well, I remember I was with Elliot. You and I were at the Conservative Home drinks event on the Sunday night at Tory conference, and the Prime Minister had just come from a meeting where she decided to ditch this, and she put a poker face on and she stood up in front of the assembled MPs and half the lobby and said how brilliantly things were going and how well it was going to go, knowing full well that in the
burning outside,
in the background, it was a remarkable a few days, really, I think, and that was, for me, that was one of the craziest conferences I've ever been to, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with James that there was no chaos at Labour. Everyone was fine and friends, and then we got to the Tories and they were all just sniping at each other. But the U-turn midway through conference, quite extraordinary. That's really not what conferences are for. That's for when you sort of boast about how fantastic your policies are, not chuck them out the window days after you've made them.
And again, Liz Truss just remained poker face throughout all of it. And it was quite remarkable. I remember sitting in the main hall and watching her speech, and she was so calm. You could see she was really enjoying giving this speech. And this is after 4 days of chaos, as you describe. And I remember seeing the only time you would even see a minister in the conference hall was when they were being chased down by some broadcast journalists and were refusing to give them any comments. And then, Liz Truss just sort of happily and calmly delivers this speech about the anti-growth coalition.
The anti-growth coalition. The aforementioned Michael Gove was, going round
himself about. Honestly, it was rare to go to an event where Michael Gove wasn't speaking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was absolutely extraordinary. And I remember walking past one of the tents, and Grant Shapps was showing off this enormous phone that he'd bought. He was essentially just using to basically launch grenades at his own government with, and this remarkable kind of, situation that was going on.
There's a really extraordinary moment where it was, I was at an event with Michael Gove, and then next door was an event with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they were both talking about each other. And then midway through, a journalist put their hand up for questions and said, Mr. Gove, Jacob Rees-Mogg just said this about you, what do you think? And then sort of just going back and forth at each other from the tent next to each other.
Via journalists.
Via journalists. Everyone was tweeting, and it was absolutely extraordinary, them just kind of sniping at each other through the wall, effectively.
Yeah, and having got through that conference,
I was going to say, and yet the week before at Labour, it was just this very slick operation. They'd done the mini budget on the Friday, and then Kwasi Kwarteng had wound everyone up even further on the Laura Kuenssberg show on Sunday. And so Labour was just lots of MPs being like, wow, are they actually doing this? All right.
Right, yeah.
and
I've been
so
to
confident, so happy.
A few Labour conferences that have been a bit of a rabble before over the past few years, and real infighting. There was the one where they tried to sack the deputy leader, Tom Watson, the day before conference started, all this kind of stuff. And it was very different from that. It was very machined and well-oiled. And I think there was a real kind of changing of the guard feel that we've talked about a lot, I think, over the year, that actually that's kind of the feeling it was. And James, what was your kind of feeling from Labour conference? What was your feeling when you left?
Well, less Hawaiian shirts, less socialist worker placards. I got a shout out at Zara Sultana's annual pub quiz with the Trot Fest, the Momentum Festival, because last year I won it by mistake. And I had to go up on stage and collect the prize, which was a jar of homemade jam from Jeremy Corbyn's allotment.
I mean, that is worth something.
Yeah, that you then brought to Labourless karaoke. I remember that.
Yeah, that was. I was now banned from that. But last year was a bigger event, and this year, I mean, the sort of Momentum side event was much smaller, and I think it shows, again, the left's continuing power within the party. I think it shows that the Starmer machine is very solid, and I think, yeah, it was a good conference for Labour. The speech went well. He's getting better, Keir Starmer's conference speeches, and I think really one of the stories of this Parliament is Labour's ongoing better relationship with business and the decline of the Tories. And if you talk to any lobbyists people were involved in there, it was like night and day in their approach.
And that conference felt like the turning point where Labour genuinely believed they actually could win the next election. And, from a sort of year in review perspective, if anyone had said in January, January 2022, do you think Labour could win the next election? You'd be like, nah, they're kind of getting better and it's not looking great for the Tory party right now, but certainly another year of time in opposition.
And that's what polling shows as well, is that most people, Labour have led since about, I think, September last year, but it was only around the time of the mini budget in this year that people now think they expect a Labour government. So they're not just voting for them, they're expecting, and that's the kind of default assumption has shifted for the first time in about a decade.
Which in 12 months is
pretty extraordinary. And we're on to number 8 now. Liz Truss stands down after, well, she stood down to 44 days. She left after 49 days to be short. I mean, just really work it out. And there are 3 quotes I'm just going to say that really summed up that moment for me. I'm a fighter, not a quitter, from Liz Truss.
And then she quits.
The Prime Minister is not under a desk, from Penny Mordaunt. It's very useful. And then I am effing furious and I don't give an F anymore.
You can do the swears. You can do the swears. I think they need the swears.
I am fucking furious and I don't give a fuck anymore. And that was Craig Whittaker, the Deputy Chief Whip, like in full view of the lobby, of everyone, of MPs in Parliament on a night when I was in New York at the time. I really wish I'd been in Parliament. That's how much of a nerd I am. But I really wish I was there because it sounded like an absolutely crazy time. There was this vote on fracking that was meant to be a confidence vote and then wasn't a confidence vote. And it really just showed that the Truss government was falling apart. James, as a biographer, where does that land in your book?
Yeah.
What kind of moment is that for you?
I think it's important. I think the mini budget was the thing that did for her and the fallout, obviously, because at that point it was like, well, if she's not going to do free market Thatcherite things, well, what's the point of her? She'd abandoned her agenda. When she sacked Kwasi as well, that was a millstone. But the fracking thing was the thing that finished her off, because there was a kind of scenario perhaps where she could survive for months, maybe even up to a year, as a conventional Tory Prime Minister.
And that was people saying that on the Monday.
Yeah, exactly. Literally
by Wednesday.
72 hours beforehand, and they thought we could do a Theresa May, because Theresa May had that disastrous snap election. She then lasted for more than 2 years. Could she do the same? But as you say, it was a fracking vote, and it was the passions that were aroused within people. They just thought they were sick of this. Anything would be better. Whatever. People were reluctant to kind of put the knife in because they'd only had a contest the previous month in September for her. But that was the thing which ridiculed them. You had a whip system breaking down. And again, it's the institutions of government. Once those break down, you can't do your media and you can't do the whips. You're finished.
Yeah, Ellie, there was, and that night as well, there was kind of allegations of harassing MPs in the lobbies. There was pictures taken of people being dragged through the lobbies, and I think that for a lot of MPs that was just well beyond the pale, right?
Yeah, it was Chris Bryant stood up in the Commons, and the leader of the Commons has since said that there is no evidence of bullying, but on the night, Chris Bryant was very, very passionately speaking about it, saying that he'd seen people being manhandled and bullied and forced. One of the people that was named was Alex Stafford, Rother Valley MP. He insists it was just a strong exchange of words, but you can see the picture that Chris Bryant posted. You can see him, and I think there's 2 whips next to him.
Yeah, I think one of the most extraordinary political pictures of this year, I think. Yeah. You never normally see inside the lobbies.
Yeah,
for good reason, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was kind of extraordinary, really, to see. Yeah.
You were in New York because we all take holidays when the drama things happen. I was off as well. But what were your experiences, both of you, of being in the Commons that week? The Prime Minister is not under a desk quote was because, Liz Truss had literally gone AWOL.
It's the same thing, because she was in Parliament but not in the Commons chamber. And so there was this statement about her future that was going on, and she sort of turned up midway through. I think, it was just a sense of, where is the leadership? I think there was a complete vacancy there, and I think there was a frustration. Basically, MPs just wanted some kind of leadership or show, and they felt that she had abandoned their whole agenda. She wasn't a good communicator, and so, as you say, you have these kind of surreal scenarios where Penny Mordaunt was going out to defend her, and it all just boiled down. It always comes back to the Parliament, I think, and the cockpit of our democracy. And when MPs are together, they can plot, and obviously they brought her down very quickly. And that was when Graham Brady was sent in to go and talk to her on the Thursday morning.
Yeah, Graham Brady, I think, is a very interesting character in the year's kind of politics. This is kind of
one fixture. Yeah.
This like dark lord that comes in and just sort of like hands the gun and tells MPs where to go. I'm going to introduce who I think is the main character of this year, which is a lettuce. Ellie, can you talk us through why a lettuce became such a big figure this year?
Oh, that was absolutely wonderful. The Daily Star set up a live stream of a lettuce and whether Liz Truss could outlast it. And I think the best thing was that it started out as just a lettuce and then it got googly eyes. And as time went on, more and more was added. They had a tofu for Suella Braverman's tofu comments and little bottles of drink and things like that, and a disco ball. And then the lettuce did outlast the Prime Minister. The lettuce was still going.
I mean, you can't really top that, can you?
It wasn't even
Try writing a book about it.
Well, I was going to... Before we come on to like numbers 9 and 10, what was your kind of wildest moment? I suppose this is the point where you finally finished the book. I remember seeing Harry that week and him being incredibly stressed the week after. And, what did you just sleep for like a week? What did you do after you finally sent it off to the publishers?
We sent it off. As the card rolled out of Downing Street, that's when we sent it off to them. And I think I did crash that evening, but it was extraordinary. It was a very difficult one. It's as we're all journalists here, so you obviously got the immediate story and what the newsline is, but also trying to talk to people about the instant reactions to the Truss government. And I think actually, funnily enough, the more we move away from that period, the stranger it looks in retrospect. The kind of more the Truss experiment, if you will, a kind of economic sewers where basically we lost the international markets and became this kind of international case. I mean, for better or worse. I mean, the way Joe Biden's tried to use it quite cynically, I think, against the Republicans. But it was an extraordinary time, and I just remember it was the world's longest Google Doc, and we had 105,000 words, just kept adding more, and we're like, Harry's like, leave it, one more quote, one more line, and an instant judgment, and hopefully it's kind of, we thought we might get 2 years out of it, we got 2 months, so...
What ended up on the cutting room floor that you wish you could have kept in?
What ended up on the cutting room floor? Do you know what, I think there's now been more people have been coming out. Asa Bennett, her speechwriter's now done a spoke to Nick Robinson, so I would have just loved to get more impressions, kind of always adding to that. But I think we pretty much kept it all in what we had before, really. I think we maybe changed a few underestimated to overestimated. But like the tense.
Because I remember the subtitle of the book has changed a few times. As the rise and then fall had to be added into it. Essentially.
Honestly, it was such a meme. It became like a sort of fixture, and we went viral. My sister's at university and Freshers Week, and she was getting the WhatsApp group messages with the meme, the picture, and my dad got it sent by some boomer chat.
So what did you? I suppose your wildest moment is becoming a meme. Then I suppose in the year
utterly surreal. Yeah, and I wrote a piece to Spectator. Will anyone buy my Liz Truss book? We ended with Fraser being like, as a sort of dig at help James out this Christmas. There's a link to it, but it was that was probably it.
That actually becomes a great live document.
I mean, it's the first chapter of history, isn't it?
Like,
we're not,
absolutely. Well, I hope we're not going to live through that kind of chaos.
Biographer to obituaries, basically.
Right. Well, let's move on to number 9, which obviously, as a result of that, the 1922 committee had to scramble to get another leader in place. They changed the rules. That threshold we talked about earlier suddenly became 100 MPs to try and squeeze out anybody from the ballot. And Boris Johnson decided actually this, enough time had elapsed. What was it, about 3 months for him to try and come back. He was actually in the Caribbean, I think, at the time, and jetted back. We were being told by his kind of surrogates.
Economy class. He jetted back economy class.
He did. We were being told by his surrogates like James Doddridge that he had the numbers or was getting close to the numbers, though we never actually got to see that list publicly of the MPs who were backing him. The big moment for me over that weekend was this summit in Millbank Tower, where the two of them go in. It's just the two of them in the room, where they decide essentially.
Boris and Rishi,
they go into this room and they come out and there's no deal. And then the next day, Boris pulls out. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in that.
What was the deal they were trying to strike?
Well,
again?
Exactly. I mean, clearly it was who gets to be Prime Minister and who gets to be Deputy. And you can imagine how that conversation would have gone. I mean, James, what did you kind of make of that weekend and that meeting? What do you think kind of the reason they didn't come to an agreement, do you think?
I think because Rishi was in a much stronger position and he recognised that and he played it very well. To do so in a way where I think he was more restrained. His camp was more restrained in its briefings. They knew they were the favourite and they didn't kind of, go out and make it a point of pride or anything like that, and basically just let events play out. And the ticking clock meant that Boris wouldn't get 100 publicly that we know of. Obviously, since then, Senator Graham Brady said he had 100 names, but we'll never know the names of those names. Put it that way. What I would say is that it's a nice way. It kind of rounds off the whole year, because we started the year talking about Partygate, ended with the Privileges Committee, and that was a huge reason to hang over this whole debate, which was hang on a sec, we can't put the guy back in. We got that rid of 6 months ago. While he's under investigation.
Still not sorted out the investigation for the reason he left in the first place.
He lied to the House.
And Ellie, famously in 2016, Boris Johnson pulled out of a leadership contest at his own launch, which is a remark. And one of the people in the front row sat there was Nadeem Zahawi and Nadine Dorries. And then this time round again, Nadeem Zahawi writes this piece for The Telegraph that goes up at 8 p.m. I think it went online at 8:02 p.m. saying how Boris Johnson should stand. And at 8 p.m, a message went round saying that Boris Johnson was going to pull out of the race. I mean, poor old Nadeem Zahawi, you know, it happened to him again, happened to him twice. I mean, you've got to feel for the guy really in that situation.
Yeah, and he wasn't the only one. James Cleverly was another one who went out, I think, on the morning, backing Boris Johnson. And quickly regretted that decision, I believe, because it made him look a bit silly. He luckily kept his job in the reshuffle.
He did, yeah.
But Nadeem Zahawi is unique in having made that mistake twice.
It's extraordinary as well how, I mean, genuinely, in July, he was one of the favourites to succeed Boris Johnson, and then he took the Chancellor job. And one of the things I got told was that the Truss camp were terrified if Boris had offered the Chancellor. What do you do at that point, where he was clearly going to cease being Prime Minister? But if you were Chancellor, you then get bound to his fate. And I think Nadeem Zahawi took that. It turned out to be a bit of a poison chalice, where as a result of that, his own launch failed to start really in that July week, got knocked out quite quickly. And then obviously since then he's had different jobs throughout the whole different around the cabinet table, I think it's just a lesson of how luck can play a role in these kind of things, and timing is everything in politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was on the Sunday night. He pulls out on the Monday. Is the deadline to get this there. Penny Mordaunt was the only other candidate who was looking like they might go for it.
And she really took it down to the wire, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. Yeah, I mean it was 2 p.m, wasn't it? And we were all waiting for whether she's going to make it or not. And then just before she announced that she was going to pull out. Yeah, exactly. And again, it led to this Sunak coronation.
Put everyone out of their misery as well, because it didn't have to then go to a wider ballot. There was going to be an online ballot of members.
There was a lot of issues about people signing up, and there was apparently 20,000 Tory members didn't have an email, which that kind of stuff, which could have been interesting. Sunak, obviously, coronation. He is in this weird position where he inherits the Chancellor and doesn't change. He inherited Jeremy Hunt, who'd taken over from Kwasi Kwarteng, and didn't change him, which is a strange position to be in. He also then put people back in a lot of the same positions they were previously, and it was almost a sense that that aberration, that period over the summer, had just not happened, and we'd just gone back to where we were previously, and it's a very strange position to find himself in, just sort of saying, all that stuff that happened, we're just going to reverse it now, and we're just going to go back to where we were, and putting people back in the same job. Michael Gove goes back to levelling up, Raab goes back to justice. It's a strange position to find ourselves in, and it's almost like, did it really happen, Ellie? Did it really happen?
Maybe it didn't.
Maybe it didn't. Maybe it's all just...
That's what CCHQ would like you to believe. There was no mini budget. What are you talking about?
It was all just a collective fever dream, and Rishi Sunak won in September, and everything's been fine since then. The Queen's still alive, everything's fine.
Yeah, right. It's a surreal position to be in, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't really make any sense, and it's obviously the fact he's taking over. Whoever took over in September would have had a very difficult position. Taking over in late October was an even harder position to be in. Laura, what have you kind of made of the way that Sunak has gone about that since? Obviously he's focused on the economy, and now he's focusing on small boats. He's kind of a strange tact that he's been taking, I suppose, and not picking too many fights, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, he's just trying to keep himself out of trouble, isn't he? And avert any more chaos. Obviously, the economy was the one thing that they had to tackle. They had to have a plan on. They were clearly willing to be unpopular because they just had to deal with it, and it was more important to be popular with the markets than MPs, as Liz Truss so brutally demonstrated. Small boats, I guess, that is something that Tory voters care a lot about. It's something that the Tory backbenchers care a lot about. So if he's going to pick one issue that he's going to make his big issue, I mean, of course, it is a real world issue that needs to be addressed as well. But there are many. We're recording this podcast right now, and I don't know if it's being picked up on the mics, but you can hear nurses shouting outside because it's the first nurses' strike in whatever. In fact, our office is just next to Guy's Hospital. I mean, the government is holding steady on strikes, they're not really responding to it. But yeah, so the fact that they've taken small boats instead is, it's like, okay, we can please our backbenchers with this. We can look politically strong and hopefully keep everyone quiet until the new year. And I mean, I think it seems that MPs are just so exhausted and
Yeah.
so tired of this year that actually there aren't any rebellions. But
Yeah,
there is a sense they're bubbling up for the new year.
I think so. And that's the number 10, the final one that we're seeing now is the kind of the push away from what we've seen this year into the next year. And, you know, there are lots of kind of the complaints about that Sunak is managing by boredom, essentially. But we're also seeing perhaps the future, and we're seeing lots of MPs suggesting they're standing down, people like Sajid Javid and some of the younger cohorts. Obviously, the probably most exciting or bizarre one of those was Matt Hancock. So Ellie, just talk us through what Matt Hancock has been doing these past few weeks.
Well, some listeners may have spotted that he was on a little show called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Reports are that he had turned it down a couple of times and then realised he hadn't got a job, and so accepted the measly £400,000 or so he's rumoured to have gotten and hopped on a plane to Australia.
Yeah. Well, he was there to talk about dyslexia, though, Ellie. Come on,
yes.
He was there to promote his dyslexia bill.
And I think he did manage to mention it at some point. I managed to avoid watching it. I survived on clips.
Right.
That was one of my favourite moments. Was Pete was with a straight face, Peter Kyle coming out and saying that he'd set back the cause of dyslexia 5 to 10 years by associating dyslexia with failure and.
Wow.
Yes, and yes. So some speculate one of the reasons why he went on I'm a Celeb, partly to rebuild his image, but also to promote his book.
Yes.
The Pandemic Diaries,
Which is not a diary.
It's not a diary. It is a telling of events in a sort of vague layout.
Based on his original diaries, I think, is it?
Yeah, I mean, based on his
messages.
emails and WhatsApps at the time.
Yes, he says in the introduction that he couldn't keep a diary at the time because he was so busy, and it would have been wrong of him to keep one.
Being the one person who spotted this pandemic that no one else spotted, essentially.
Well, I mean, I look forward to the inquiry. Going over the record with him next year under oath.
That's going to be quite an interesting one.
We'll look forward to the book being read out to him.
Yeah. And
it was not surprising to see him stand down after that show, was it? Because it was just so clear that he was launching his future broadcast career, and I think there is a sense amongst all these MPs that are standing down, particularly young ones. That
look, he just fell in love, Laura.
They've given up.
He just fell in love. That was he just fell in love.
Well, good for
In all
him.
seriousness, if you go on TikTok and look at the comments he gets on his videos versus on Twitter, it's worlds apart. There's he's a bit of a meme. I can see the kind of Michael Portillo transition from cabinet member, 1 point ran for leader, instead going to be coming soon to a light entertainment show near you.
And why not? Because if the polls are true, MPs like him are thinking, all right, well, do I want to spend time in opposition, or what other career could I have? And because he can clearly see that he's got this public popularity and he could become a pundit, that's the choice he's made.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the thing, the difference, I suppose, between the different groups in the party, the Conservative Party, which is sort of splitting open. Ellie and I had a lovely chat with Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, for another podcast, and he's on the other camp. He's very much like, no, we need to just stick together. And we need to realise that Labour are going to be in power and we don't want to be in opposition. Opposition's awful. But there is that kind of break between those ones who think, maybe actually things are winding down, essentially. And I suppose that's the big thing for next year is which side is going to win out in those two elements.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think people forget that we are effectively less than 18 months away from an election if they follow the pattern of having a May election. They can wait until December 2024 and push it to 2025. But let's hope they don't do that, because I don't want a winter election. But we've not got long. They've not got long to turn things round. Labour are 20 points ahead, and they've been in power for quite a while. So it's not looking great, and it does look like opposition might be on the horizon.
And it's it's a cost of living crisis. Inflation's going up. We've just had an announcement from the Bank of England that mortgage rates are going to go up. I will mention again, there are nurses striking outside. It's going to be very difficult for them to turn it around next year, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think one prediction I'll maybe foolishly make is that perhaps we'll probably see less chaos than this year.
Right, so that's my final question to you, was actually going to be, if we're doing this podcast this time next year, those 10 moments, they're going to be quite
the year
different.
of 4 prime ministers, yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. What do you think? What do you think we're going to be talking about this time next year?
Because Starmer and Sunak have put a premium on competence and basic managerialism.
Delivery, right?
Delivery, yeah, exactly. So I think probably less the rhetoric of sort of Johnson and Truss, a bit less rhetoric and more kind of focus on delivery, and that's kind of the pact they've both made each other. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of clear blue water opens up between them. Labour got a good holding line for now. We're not going to go in details about pay negotiations. We're going to have we'll do non-doms to raise a bit of money, but ultimately there's not that much in the policy differences now. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of dividing lines open up in the next year.
That's all we've got time for, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com, and keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day-a-week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right-hand corner of the website. Thanks to my guests, Eleanor Langford, Laura Silver and James Heale. And thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter @PoliticsHome or email us via news@politicshome.com. Look out for next week when we'll be taking a look at what's coming up in 2023 and trying to answer the big questions about the next year in politics. But for now, I've been Alain Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.